Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion arranged by Kearney in association with CNBC Arabia. My name is Mayben Khadra, and it's my pleasure to be the moderator of this session. Our world is changing fast. The pace of change, particularly when it comes to new technologies, means that the half-life of skills is shrinking fast. The education sector must adapt in line with this shift and reflect the fact that essential in-demand skills of the future will be very different from what has been taught in the past. In other words, what we teach has to change. Furthermore, how we teach must also change to reflect the rapid digitization that is taking place across all industries, not just education. During this panel, we will be exploring the new themes in the education sector to see how and what we teach and how we teach is like to be transformed over the next few years. We welcome our speakers today, Dr. Sonia bin Jafar, CEO, Abdallah Al Ghureir Foundation for Education, Dr. Saima Rana, Chief Education Officer, GEMS Education, and Mr. Marco Vasconi, partner at Kearney. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I want to start with you, Dr. Saima, and some numbers. LinkedIn predicts 150 million in new technology jobs in the next 5 years. To what extent do you think that these numbers will actually put even more pressure on the education sector to evolve and prepare students for a new type of jobs that will emerge during the next 5 or 10 years?
So very few jobs today don't use technology. So the education sector is already preparing students to not only be able to handle new technologies in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, but actually to create, be the co-creators of this new innovation, new technologies, be the producers, and then be the end users as well. So any good school or any good education provider, like GEMS Education, is already making sure that children are resilient, agile, flexible enough to be able to interact with these technologies that exist today, but also the new technologies that will exist tomorrow. So, for example, when you look at children in our provision, children are able to really understand research and development of solutions that are needed to combat all the different and variety of issues and problems that face our world today. And a lot of these are technological solutions. So children are already working on these. I think the main area of preparation is not necessarily how to use these technologies, but it's about how to engage with these technologies. And the engagement comes from really understanding the use of the technology to enhance societal pressures or the environment that exists today. So I think great schools are already doing this.
Great. So, Mr. Marco, here we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution and what does it mean for the education sector. And we're talking about impacting more than 50% of jobs. This is a huge number.
Yes, absolutely. It's a staggering number indeed. And when we think about the fourth industrial revolution, we need to think differently about this particular industrial revolution compared to the previous ones. The previous ones all opened a very long-term, stable economic and labor market cycle. And that means for the education sector that you could get a degree, get a qualification, and you will be quite resilient for your entire career. Now, this fourth industrial revolution is fundamentally different in the speed of change. And this speed of change is impacting the labor market in two main ways. The first way is that it's impacting existing jobs by disrupting and potentially displacing jobs through technology and automation. For example, any routine type of work, whether it's manual or cognitive, for example, manual, you're talking about manufacturing jobs, or cognitive, paralegal jobs or translation services, these are likely to be disrupted by technology and potentially displaced. But when it comes also to the other side of the coin, there are also new opportunities, new jobs being created that didn't exist before. If we go back just 20 years ago, it would have been unlikely to think about having millions of people working in social media marketing at the time. So this is the change that we're seeing in the labor market due to the technology and due to the fourth industrial revolution. What does this mean for the individual? In a phrase, we can say that we're moving from one career in a lifetime to multiple careers over a lifetime.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Sonia, we were talking about just now the evolution of labor markets throughout the last industrial revolution and the one that we are experiencing now. And we talked about this huge number of new jobs that will emerge, but the material as well, the content, the educational content is also changing. We're talking about more digitized content that is actually more personalized and more flexible. To what extent do you think that more needs to be done when it comes to this content?
I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done, especially in the education sector. So even though there have been efforts in schools and universities, what we are seeing is that the corporates are actually taking on a role of an educator, because when they're receiving their talent, they're finding that they need to upskill them quicker. And that goes to the pace of change that you mentioned. And so what we're doing at the foundation is really working directly with the industry and asking them to do some predictive analysis on what is the profile that they will be hiring, and then looking to different kinds of providers, those that are not necessarily always traditional providers, although we do work with those, to be able to upskill in that digital space. So we're looking at anything from digital literacy, from the basics, the foundations, to agile learning, and how do you get into little stackable courses or stackable credentials versus what you had mentioned, which is the traditional model. Let's go to school for 4 years and then hope that we have a job for the rest of our lives, when the half-life of some of these skills is 4 years. So it doesn't always add up. So we do need to move fast in the education sector.
So what do you think about that, Dr. Saima? Especially that I think it's difficult for some schools today to keep up with this rapid change, whether in technology, digitization, and kind of developing the online content.
Look, I think, you know, resource is important. Schools need to have the budgets and they need to have access to resource. So there is an equity issue, I suppose, in schools, if we're talking about the global sort of piece. But education it sits in a sphere, it sits in a place, like family, like relationships, like love, religion, poetry, spirituality. It's not something that can be digitized and replaced. So if I can give you an example, it fits very nicely into the cultural sphere of life and society. One cannot replace Shakespeare with Beckett. Right? So it's not this evolution, the fourth evolution. It's great, and this is exactly what we need, I'm sure. But it's not about replacement theory education. Education is like a recurso effect. You have to go back to things to understand deep meaning. So the content and the knowledge, whether it's past, present, or future, is something that is done through learning and pedagogy and understanding relationships and people. And we saw under the global pandemic how important those things were. We had great technologies to help us continue to learn and to live a life for the last 2.5, 3 years. But we still needed and we craved for all those great things that make a great education. The expressive arts, the relationships, having face-to-face conversations. And just recently in this region, the face masks in Dubai, the face masks have disappeared, and how happy people are to be able to just connect with each other.
Yes.
Now, technology, of course, has a place in society, and I'm a techno enthusiast, but I don't think it replaces great learning and great education. We are not mini organizations preparing children for the world of work. We are organizations that are educating the whole child through a holistic education provision. So, for example, at GEMS Education, we ensure that we educate the child's mind through all those great subjects like mathematics, science, engineering, information technology, and so on, artificial intelligence, all those great experiences we give them. We educate the heart, which is all about relationships and friendships and falling out and making up and being upset and failure and winning and all of those great things. We educate the body through physical education, dance, drama, and all of those great things. And then we, of course, educate the spirit. And by that, I don't mean religious spirituality. I mean actual spirituality where you're connecting with people. Now, the outcome of that is very much a holistic, educated child who is able to go out into the future, because we don't know what the future holds. Technology is just super fast at the moment, and you can't keep up with it. Our children know better uses of technology than we could ever imagine.
Yes.
They're creating this technology, and as you said, the social media platform. The kids in our provision know how to use it far better than we could ever know how to use it. So I genuinely believe it's not about necessarily creating children who are able to use this technology, but it's about creating children who know when to use it, how to use it, where to use it.
Beautiful.
So that intervention piece needs to come into it.
Yes, so Dr. Saima was talking about the human elements in the education sector and the importance of having educators learn how to touch on the human factors and human emotions of the students. I remember when we saw this huge technological advancement globally, I was worried that I will be replaced by a robot, that essentially somewhere down the road, there will be a robot actually announcing the news and I will not be needed. Do you think that robots can one day be teachers at schools and they will do a good job at teaching these soft skills that the doctor was talking about?
I think the doctor already answered the question to some extent. There is a place for technology, for sure, in education, and technology is definitely an augmentation of the experience, and it gives you the ability to collaborate, to interact at any time from anywhere, and this is great and it's fantastic, and it's something that we definitely didn't have when we were growing up. So does that mean that this is going to replace the central role of human interaction and teachers? Absolutely not. We believe that teachers are still at the core of the education journey, and the human interaction is still very relevant. And when we talk about, and we did before, about the Industrial Revolution and what jobs are going to be displaced or disrupted, the non-routine jobs, which are definitely, there's a lot of them. For example, healthcare, education itself is a non-routine job. These are unlikely to be disrupted. Okay. And this is where we see a lot of the growth potential for the labor market in the future, but also for technology to play a supplementary role, a complementary role, but definitely not to replace human interaction.
Great. So we're going to be going into a short break. After the break, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be talking about the new skills that are required in the labor market in the following 10 years, and to what extent is the education sector today liable to teach our kids and the students these skills that are emerging as we speak. So going to a short break, and then we're going to be back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we are here at this panel discussion. We're talking about the future of education with so much taking place in the sector during the last 2 years. I think COVID-19 has accelerated the digitization and technology in this particular sector. So going back to you, Dr. Saima, before the break we were discussing how the human element is important in the education sector. I want to discuss also some of the skills that you think are important to thrive in the labor market in the 21st century. What are these skills in your opinion?
Look, I mean, I think schools have been teaching 21st century skills forever, I think. You know, I think these are really important skills, and people call them soft skills, and we compare them to hard skills. The skills that we teach our children today in our education provision are very much based around character traits. So being resilient, being agile, being caring, being a team player, knowing how and when to be a leader in a situation and how and when to be a team player in a situation. These things are really incredibly important. Technology plays a huge part in that. Hard skills are very important as well. However, when we come back to being a holistic learner or a holistic person, when we think about organizations, they need great people who have the genuine philosophy and desire to make a difference, I think, in all organizations. That's the kind of people we want. Of course, we heard a little bit earlier from my colleague here that companies are finding people coming in and then they don't necessarily have the right skills.
Yes.
So I'll go back to what I said earlier. If we are able to develop holistic learners who know how to intervene and how to enhance things like problem solving and finding solutions to make a better world, then actually they can contribute much more to a company. And that, I think, comes from soft skills. You mentioned COVID-19 and the pandemic. Yes, we saw how brilliant technology can be and how agile we need to be when we use technology. But when we think back once again, the things that really got us through COVID-19 were all the mental health and wellness aspects of being alive. And that, of course, also transfers to education. So children were able to get through the global pandemic by doing things, whether it was online or in person, which really allowed them to grow and flourish. And it was things like the expressive arts, the PE, the sports, all of those great things that helped them to overcome all of that.
The soft
dreadful,
skills.
the soft skills. And so again, I go back to the teamwork, the resilience, the character, the caring, being compassionate, understanding how to fail and how to try again, not giving up. All of those things are incredibly important. And I think they're more so important today when we also look at the UNESCO SDG skills as well, you know, the objectives there. They're so much more important today because the world is crying out for great people, kind people, people that want to do good and make a difference in the world. So I think those soft skills are things that we're absolutely teaching in our schools at GEMS Education, and dare I say, most good schools are already teaching.
So I love this point that the doctor here had just mentioned, that actually COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the importance of soft skills for people globally and for the young generation. To what extent do you agree that this has also been highlighted by the education sector, especially in the region, in the Middle East?
Well, one of the issues that we've had in the Middle East with the education sector is that it has been traditional in a lot of ways in terms of not developing the holistic child, as you were saying. We at the Abdullah Al Khawair Foundation for Education deal more with the 15 to 35-year-old learner rather than the elementary learner. But in that zone, what we are noticing is massive inequity. And so when we are talking about those soft skills and trying to teach people those soft skills and how much that is valued by industry, well, it's always been valued, even pre-pandemic. If you look at the World Economic Forum, and you look at the 10 top skills that were predicted to be the most important, it's exactly what you were talking about. It's agility, it's leadership, creativity. If you look at the list, in fact, there's only 2 out of the 10 skills that talk about technology use. The rest of it is about what you're calling soft skills, or some people call transferable skills.
Yes.
And so the idea behind all of our programs, and this is one of the reasons we do it, is if you go to a nice private school, or if you are lucky enough during the pandemic to have gone to school or had internet during that time, and we deal with a lot of vulnerable populations who didn't have that, well, then all of those pieces that you're talking about are potentially there, and clearly you're talking about schools and populations that have it. But when you have mass inequity, then what you are doing is creating an inequilibrium in your population. And so being able to say, how are we going to meet those sustainable development goals? And not wait, we can't actually afford to wait to meet them. We need an action plan to meet them now. How are we going to make sure that there is education for all, and education that is meaningful? How are we going to make sure that there's internet access for all, and meaningful internet access? And that meaningfulness does have that human component, but it also means that we need digitally literate individuals who have access. And so that's what we're doing at the foundation, is trying to embed all of those pieces into our programs, so that it isn't just about a small population who are privileged in a lot of ways, but it's about a holistic population. And in the Middle East, it's extremely diverse, and access is diverse. And so we are trying to figure out how to work around and allow for programs that will be able to access the rural areas as well as the metropoles. And those are different kinds of programming. And I think that when you're looking at kind of macroeconomics, you can't just look at this one segment. And we do have to look at it. And that is your future talent pool. So when you're looking at skills and employability, you're looking at a future talent pool that may not have access to being able to develop all of those soft skills.
Yes, of
so how are we
course.
going to make that happen?
Yes, because of huge diversity we are seeing in the Middle East when it comes to the education sector. But Mr. Marco, one of the things that was evolving recently is the knowledge and the talk about lifelong learning. What are your expectations on that, and especially that now we have online certificates, online diplomas, online master degrees, even PhD degrees? Because of COVID, all the big universities in the world are offering online programs. So what does that mean for lifelong learning?
Well, we certainly see that this is a trend that is emerging, and definitely in the last couple of years has become quite dominant. And we've had several discussions with governments around the region about exactly this topic. The fourth industrial revolution is disrupting the labor market, and as a consequence, it will be changing the education sector. And this includes, if we're talking about the alignment with the labor market from technical high school, so you already have a number of people that join from the high school into the labor market, but it's mostly impacting the tertiary education, so university education and also technical and vocational education. And then later on, it's impacting also lifelong learning. So when we're thinking about the formal education, which is, let's say, university and technical vocational education, we see a few trends here that are quite important. One is a focus on employability and on alignment with the labor market. What we see is governments, ministries of education, and also education institutions are trying to come up with programs that give a better return on investments for the students and for their families. If you think about the US, for example, the amount of investment that goes into education is astronomical, and very often that return on investment is not as great. So what we see is definitely this trend towards more employability and more focus on alignment with the labor market. As part of that, we see that the offering of programs is changing. We're seeing a focus on more shorter programs and more skill-based programs. And this goes back to the change that we were discussing before about how the labor market is changing and the relationship of people between the labor market and the education sector. So what we'll see very often in the future is people bouncing back and forth every 5 to 10 years between the labor market and the education sector. And of course, they cannot do so by acquiring every time another bachelor's degree.
Yes,
so we'll have to have access to shorter programs that are giving them a better return and faster return of the investment. The last point that we see is that there is an emerging trend towards more practical experience. If you think about university education, it's been largely in the past 50 to 100 years always focused on theory. Very little practical experience has been embedded in university education. This is changing because of the pace of change in the labor market. And what we see is university adopting different models, including better and stronger collaboration with the industry, with employers, to give a more practical experience to students. This includes the design and deliver a program together with the industry. Very often we see educators that don't have much practical experience, so people that are teaching marketing but have never held a marketing job in their lives. And this needs to change, and we see that this is changing, and more industry leaders are going to participate in the education sector. Now, this is the formal education. When we go to lifelong learning, this is outside of the formal education per se, right? We're not talking about traditional education. We're talking about people who are already in the labor market. And based on the World Economic Forum, more than 30% of jobs will be disrupted by technology and will need upskilling and reskilling by 2030. What does that mean for an individual, company, education sector, and government? For individuals, it means that they need to change their mindset and shift to a more quicker and aligned back and forth between the labor market and the education sector, what we discussed before. We mentioned earlier also what does it mean for companies and employers. They need to invest in the upskilling and reskilling of their workforce to keep them productive and resilient and contribute to their ambitions. What it means for an education sector, as we said before, they need to adapt the program offering, the offering of the programs to the students and to companies. what it means for governments at the same time, which is very important. Governments need to put in place policies and regulations that are conducive to upskilling and reskilling. For example, giving leave of absences to employees without any impact on employment benefits and employment in general. Giving subsidies, giving other incentives for companies to facilitate the entry of the workforce into the training and the education sector and then back into the labor force.
Okay, so you mentioned two very important points, theory versus practical education and the role of governments. We're going to go on a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about these two factors and what do they mean for elementary, middle, and high schools. And we are back to this panel discussion. We're talking about the future of education. We're discussing the new skills, the new way we should teach, and all the technological advancement and how did it impact this sector. So Dr. Saima, before the break, Mr. Marco was mentioning theory versus practical education. And I've seen it in the education sector. I've actually experienced it myself because there was always a gap between what we are taught and when it comes to real life practice. To what extent do you think that this puts even more pressure on the whole system to change the mindset of teaching not the theories but the practicalities of how the theories are applied in real life?
So any good school would not only teach theory, you have to have a practical element in the provision that you offer. So children will of course understand that there's knowledge, but that knowledge sometimes is outdated. So they have to look at what's happening today and putting it into a context that they're living in this society, in their society. Good schools will have a number or a variety of pathways. And those pathways, for example, the International Baccalaureate has the very academic pathway, but again, that has huge offers of practical experiences within the curricula. But it also has the career-related program, which is very practical, very hands-on, because of course children come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes and ages, and they know how best they want to learn, and a lot of children like to learn through practical activities. So I've not yet visited a school that only teaches theory, and I've been in education for a very long time. You know, the practicalities of the different areas that exist in our society have to be taught. And good teachers do that very well. And they do that by not only delivering a curriculum off the shelf, but they do that in tandem, in partnership, in genuine relationships with higher education authorities, with businesses, with organisations, with governments, with charitable organisations, to ensure that the provision that we offer our children is one that absolutely ensures that they are all-rounded. We've got to remember that we're not preparing children for the world of work. We're educators educating children.
That's right.
We're not preparing them for the world of work. So when people say we get these children and they don't have the talent or they don't have the skill set, that's not what our job is. Our job is to ensure that our children have great attitudes, great experiences of a variety of curricula and a variety of different types of learning styles, so that when they leave us, they are able to do anything and everything that they want to. So genuinely have choice. And that choice could be to go into higher education. It could be to go into the world of work. It could be to become an intern, take a work experience, get married, travel the world, become a philanthropist. It could be anything. So we're not creating these robots to go into the world of work. We're creating great citizens, global citizens, who are able to be agile, resilient, caring, loving, compassionate human beings that will help restore our planet to where it ought to be and be able to really remove all those barriers that make the world a great place.
Mr. Marco was talking about how regulations are important for the sector, and you were mentioning earlier that we have a great diversity when it comes to access to technology, access to education in the Middle East. What's the role of governments in the region when it comes to building this sector and preparing what Dr. Saima was talking about, which is good citizens, good, happy, healthy citizens?
And I will say that I do agree with you that I don't think K through 12 is graduating workers. I think that if we can embed that love of learning, which is what it really is all in a nutshell, and the capacity to learn anywhere, that is what you were talking about. That is who we need in the talent pool, because then they can go anywhere. And, you know, if you go somewhere and you find yourself unable to handle whatever it is that they're asking you to do in terms of task, you actually now know how to ask for help, where to go for help, how to learn, and you're not afraid to learn. And that's what that practical element does. The governments are really dealing with so much in this region. We're extremely privileged in the United Arab Emirates to have a regulatory framework that is so pro-youth. That's really the way it needs to be said. They have a regulatory framework that was put out for recognizing and accrediting online education in 2019 before the pandemic. And so we have been working with 9 universities and the Ministry of Education to put a lot of the best universities here, the best programs online, and go beyond that. We have the regulatory frameworks where they have incentivized local talent, and they have incentivized internships, and they have incentivized the ability to take time off work without any kind of negativity or any kind of penalization, so that you can go out and get upgraded or upskilled in somehow. So there's been a really great regulatory framework locally here, and we have seen more of that in the GCC. You leave that region and you go into, for example, where we work a lot in Lebanon and Jordan,
yes,
where we have a refugee education crisis. So they're already dealing with economic downturns. They're already dealing with a lot of disenfranchisement over there. And then they're also dealing with the refugee population that they've absorbed and welcomed. And so if you look at the work that we're doing with the Refugee Education Fund, for example, we have managed to work with different organizations that are international, such as UNICEF and UNESCO and UNHCR, who are working with the governments there to assure that that equity is spread out. So when we're talking about what the governments are doing, I think that within their reality and their context, they are doing their absolute best in a very fast-changing world with great demands. But I will say that I don't know that governments can do it alone. And that's why in the SDG model, you have SDG 17, which is about partnerships. And that clearly is about assuring that the private sector steps up. So rather than creating bubbles just for themselves, actually entering into the talent development pipeline, but in a very responsible way, not stepping on the toes of educators, but coming hand in hand with educators to provide that practical experience. So if we look, for example, at one of our programs, the internship guide that we've co-designed with a lot of people here and across the Middle East, what we do see is an opportunity for young people to leave the university, which is where we mostly work, and actually go into a corporation or a public sector or an NGO and have a work experience for 8 weeks, 16 weeks, longer term, and some of them are paid, and that's what we've been pushing for, so that there is a give and take and they are getting that experience and then they go back to school. Okay. And so we're seeing a lot more of that, and the governments have been opening those doors. So I think that they are in there trying, but we definitely have a lot of demands on governments, and they are
course.
definitely opening up those doors.
Yes.
Can I come in there? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
In terms of the regulatory bodies currently, I think the new sort of inspection frameworks have come out for the sector that I work in. And I think one of the things, and I love so much about this region, but one of the things that I'm most proud of at the moment about working in this region and for the government here is that at the heart of their inspection, they have very much focused on the things that we have all been talking about. And that is very much about student well-being, mental health, looking at children of determination, looking at inclusion, looking at children that are refugee children coming into this region now, because we have them here as well, the English as an additional language children, and really framing that inspection framework with those core elements. That is the right thing to do for educators. You know, technology is important. You know, practical experiences are important. Of course they are.
But these human factors,
things, if you don't have those right, and as we've heard earlier, if you don't have these right, you cannot land in a job.
Of course.
And be able to deal with the politics of an organisation, to deal with the things that happen last minute. And that's not what we're looking for. In the future, what we're looking for, and currently what we're looking for, is great people who are able to deal with all of the bad things sometimes happen in the world, like COVID-19, and be able to get up and continue going. So I think that's been amazing. And I think the other thing I would like to add is at GEMS Education, we have a program called GEMS for Life. And that looks after our alumni program, our university pathways for children. But one of the great things about this program is the third vertical, which is all about internships and work-related learning. And the government has very much supported us in that. And that's about taking children and giving them an experience to be in the practical office space or with great organisations, to be able to learn those skills both ways. So the organisation is learning what they need to do better in terms of partnering with educators, and educators are learning what they need to do better in order to prepare children to be agile, resilient, and all those things.
Okay, great. But Marco, I want to get back to you with what Dr. Sonia was mentioning earlier, that some of the countries in the Middle East are already under huge pressure economically and socially, and are dealing with refugee programs. For the region here, for the GCC, it's easy to attract global talent, but for other regions in the Middle East, it's very difficult. So how do you see that factor playing in?
Well, I think this is a very important topic, and when a government thinks about the economy and the future of the country, the government thinks about two main sources of talent. There's a local talent, or the existing stock of talent, people that are already residing in the country. And we know that any investment in the education space is going to be long-term. So changing the way of teaching, changing the way of learning, and giving the students the skills that they need from the beginning is going to take many, many years. You know, we're talking about an investment that will give benefits over 10 to 20 years. At the same time, the region, especially the GCC, is faced with a more shorter-term challenge, which is how do we capture, as a region, the benefits of the massive investments into the economy that is ongoing in the GCC in particular. And this is something that is complementary to the discussion we've had so far, which is more longer term. And governments in the region have realized that talent is a scarce resource. And global talent in particular is complementary to local talent. And what we see globally speaking, but also in the region, governments have put into place programs and strategies to attract global talent, to move to the country, to move to the region. We've seen, of course, that UAE has done a lot in this space, but even Saudi Arabia recently has announced a special talent visa, the entrepreneur visa, the investor visa, and we have been part of that discussion with the government for a long time. This is fundamental for the region to be able to capture the investment that it's making into itself, into its own resources, and into its future. If you ask any tech startup in the region, how easy has it been to hire coders or developers, and they'll say it's been a nightmare. It's been extremely difficult. So having that access to global talent is fundamental for the growth of the economy in the region. If you think about the impact of global talent, when you bring global talent to a region, and we're talking about highly skilled talent to bring experience and capabilities and also financial means, there is a huge impact on local economy. So in terms of GDP contribution, if you think about the US, for example, $1.2 trillion in spending power with the migrant population. And if you think about innovation, for example, 40% of the patents granted in 2018 from the World Intellectual Property Organization were given to migrants, to global talent. So what we see is that there is a recognition that global talent is complementary. What does that mean for the education sector? This is where we connect the dots with the education sector locally. In the past, global talent was mobile because of mostly financial and economic opportunities and sometimes naturalization reasons. They wanted to have a different nationality. In today's world, global talent is so scarce that they have a choice. They can choose where to go. And very often they choose based on quality of life. One of the key drivers of quality of life is, of course, the education offering. This is something that the UAE, for example, and Qatar as well, have seen and have understood a long time ago. And you see some of the international brands that are here from the Sorbonne University, New York University, INSEAD, and London Business School in the UAE.
Yes.
This has been an effort that is understood is going to drive talent and their decision-making process to make a decision to come to a particular country. We see other countries in the region like Saudi Arabia that are opening up for international brands and international education. All of this will put positive pressure to the quality of education in the region, and it's going to create a multiplier effect to improve quality of education.
Especially now because we have in the region the vision to diversify government revenues away from oil, and talent is really a great resource for these economic plans. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Our speakers were Dr. Sonia bin Jafar, CEO, Abdullah Al Ghurair Foundation for Education. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Saima Rana, Chief Education Officer at GEMS Education, and Mr. Marco Vasconi, partner at Kearney. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an interesting topic, and of course it branches out not only to communities, but as you mentioned, Mr. Marco, even to the economic aspects of countries. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This was the end of our panel. We talked about the future of education with our speakers. We will see you next panel. Goodbye.